Hey guys, Ark Templar here. I've been doing a lot of Game of Thrones lately, and here's another one. This one is called How Westeros Works, and this is me attempting to explain how Westeros works. A lot of people come to Game of Thrones not having read any history or political science, and they might be a bit overwhelmed by how the governmental system works in universe. Uh, what's nice about Game of Thrones is it really opens up a lot of people to learning history because it's largely how things worked historically. I mean, there's a couple minor inaccuracies, they dramatize stuff, but it's largely how things worked. In many sense, I think they take a dimmer view of history than what is commonly understood, but overall, I think it's fairly historically accurate on the whole. So, let's look at how things work. So, Westeros is confusing to a lot of people, and understandably so, because it is not a kingdom, it is an empire. I know it sounds weird that I'm calling it an empire when it's called the Kingdom of Westeros, but just bear with me. Um, there is a significant difference between a kingdom and an empire, although they're often used interchangeably. Both, at least generally speaking, have a monarch, a hereditary monarch, or in the case of the Roman Empire, a non hereditary monarch, who is chosen based on some criteria, and they possess autocratic powers, at least in theory. Uh, there's some kind of subtle differences between the two. Generally speaking, empires are often more centralized and have more of a bureaucracy, and the emperor or ruler has more power, and kingdoms often are less centralized. But we're not really going to get into that because that doesn't really apply in this case. So the Iron Throne was a empire that was created by the Targaryens, and let me just turn on High Lordships, who were the High Lords or the Lords of Dragonstone, and they controlled Dragonstone, and they conquered all of Westeros and fused it together. Hence the metaphor of the Iron Throne itself, which is the swords of all the defeated lords merged together in a throne using dragon fire. And despite calling itself a kingdom, it is an empire. So the difference in Westeros is that, or I mean in Game of Thrones and the difference between a kingdom and empire is an empire is multinational. Now nations didn't exactly exist as we understand them today. Kingdoms were not the same thing as nations. Some nations and kingdoms had the same borders. Like France basically has the same borders. It's changed a bit, but the Kingdom of France is largely the same as modern day France. The Kingdom of England is pretty much the same as modern day England. The Kingdom of Scotland is modern day Scotland. So there were some kingdoms who were nations. But an empire, in contrast, can contain several nations. And it can contain kings, because an emperor is a king of kings. An emperor is a step above kings. So you can have kings who are vassalized by an emperor. There's no higher form than an emperor because the highest unit, generally speaking, in international governance is the state or the nation state. Once again, it didn't exist as we understood it today, but nations did exist in some form. Um, and even very far back, there was an understanding that that there were nations, even if borders didn't align to them. So here we're looking at the Roman Empire, and this is kind of very much where we get the modern boundaries of Europe from. Now I know it's a bit weird considering how far back Rome is, and some peoples like the Slavs didn't even really exist. Well, they may have existed, but they weren't where they were today. Like there weren't any Slavs in the South Slavs hadn't migrated here yet, and the Germans hadn't migrated south yet. But if you look at the colored boundaries largely are the Roman provinces, and the lines are borders, and they largely coincide with modern day borders. And these were to some extent respected throughout the Middle Ages. So from time to time, there was a kingdom of Italy, which would be tended to be the northern half of Italy, but people who did not occupy all of the traditional region called Italy tended to call themselves a duke, and we'll get to what a duke is, but they would not call themselves kings. Um, France is interesting because was a kingdom of Aquitaine from time to time, but once France became a country, that became the Duchy of Aquitaine, the Duchy of I forget Provence or whatever they called it down there. Um, Belgium was from time to time a kingdom, from time to time a Duchy of France. It kind of, some of these move back and forth, but a lot of these are fairly similar to modern day kingdoms. So people who did not occupy all of a traditional region or were not king of all of a people being fairly kind of like a proto-nation, would call themselves Grand Prince or just Prince or Duke or Lord or Archduke or something. Like the Habsburgs were emperors, but they were also the Archdukes of Austria, because Austria is traditionally considered to be part of Germany, and they didn't directly control all of Germany. So they were the Archdukes of Austria because it's a large piece of land, but it's not the entire nation. Whereas with like Britannia, that's basically exact. I think that's the exact borders of modern day England. Wales is ambiguous. Some people consider it part of England. I know the Welsh don't, but it's very similar in terms of borders. So the kings of England called themselves kings, and the kings of Scotland called themselves kings, and the borders were largely the same. Spain's interesting because there's a bunch of small kingdoms who called themselves kings, but eventually the kings of Castile gained prominence, and they called themselves the kings of all Spain, or the kings of all Spains, identifying that all the other kings were subordinate to them because they ruled all of Spain. So hopefully that makes some sense. My point being, an empire can have vassal kingdoms. There was not a king of Italy during the Roman era. Actually, Italy was the personal demesne of the emperor, so that's probably a bad example. But there was, like, they would appoint a equestrian prefect of Egypt who ruled an area the size of modern Egypt, basically. He ruled a kingdom. Egypt existed as basically a nation and as a state within the Roman Empire, despite being subordinate to the emperor. Armenia actually had a king, and there was a number of kings, both greater and lesser, but all were subordinate to the Roman emperor. So, what I'm trying to say is a empire contains multiple nations, and the idea of the nation has existed for a long time. It's waxed and waned depending on what the governmental system was. Early Rome was very nationalistic. Then it kind of became more culturalistic. Then politics kind of became all about personal relationships and family rights. And then it kind of went to the modern nation state. So with regards to Westeros, Westeros is an empire. So if we just flip this on, de jure regions. So as you can see, when the Targaryens came from Dragonstone, they used their dragons to defeat all these kingdoms. These were all former kingdoms. All the regions of Westeros used to have kings. The Reach used to have a king. Dorne used to, well, Dorne also has a prince, but it's basically a king. The Westerlands had the king. The Iron Isles did. The Riverlands did not actually. They're a bit different, but it is a composite region. The Vale had one, and the North had one. So all these regions had a king, and when the Targaryens conquered them, they tended, if the family was still alive, to leave the family who had been king of the region in power. And they would also, in addition to that, they didn't change the borders. The Crownlands were always kind of a contested, disputed area, so they were just annexed to the Targaryens directly, and no one really minded that much. Well, they weren't really in a position to mind, but these areas were always contested. They were not really a traditionally part of any kingdom. The Stormlands controlled them at some point. The Reach controlled them at some point. The Iron Isles controlled them at some point. The Westerlands did. They were contested land, but the borders of internal Westeros did not change after the Targaryen conquest. So, what am I trying to say? Each region of Westeros has its own culture. It has its own culture. It has its own identity. To some extent, it has its own religion, although most of Westeros follows Faith of the Seven, with the exception of the North. But there are differences in culture. There's differences in ethnicity. Everyone pretty much in Westeros are white Europeans, or the in-universe equivalent of white Europeans. Some of them are different though. Like Northerners are a lot paler. The Dornish are like Spanish, so they're a lot more Mediterranean. Stormlanders are somewhere in between. The Reach are kind of like the French. I'll do a video explaining the parallels, kind of. But the point is, the like Mace Tyrell, for instance, is basically the king of the Reach. All the people within the Reach are subordinate to him, and he is a vassal of the Iron Throne, which is an empire. Tywin Lannister is a king. He is the king of the Westerlands. They do not, because of the way the semantics of this universe, the Iron Throne is called a kingdom, which it isn't, but it's called a kingdom, and he's called the king of the Iron Throne. So you cannot call the people of these regions kings. So they are instead called Lord Paramounts. So, like Ned Stark is Lord Paramount of the North. Jon Arryn is Lord Paramount of the Vale, etc. There are two exceptions to this. They don't call that in the game. I believe that the Greyjoys are called Lord Reaper of Pike, but they're basically Lord Paramounts. The big exception is the Prince of Dorne is just called a prince. But keep in mind, the difference between a sovereign prince and a king, there really isn't a difference, because prince just means first citizen. So it can be used, like you can have a principality which just has a sovereign ruler. Like I believe Pentos, let me see here. Yeah, the head of Pentos is theoretically a prince, despite Pentos being an independent state, and he is not the heir to the throne. You can have a prince, and frequently, like I believe, the Impaler was the Prince of Wallachia. So in essence, he was the king of Wallachia, but because of the fact that he did not control all of Romania or all of a large enough area, he just took the title prince instead of king. So, king and prince basically mean the same thing. Lord Paramount is basically a king. So all the great houses, be they the Tullys, be they the, let me see if I put this on, dynasties. Oh, it doesn't show that. They are all de facto kings. All the great houses control a kingdom of varying size and power. So it's important to keep that in mind. Some great houses are more prestigious than others. Like the Starks have ruled the North for like 6,000 or like 4,000 years, whereas the Tullys were only elevated to um, Lord Paramountcy after the Targaryen conquest. So there is a number of differences in prestige and rank between the various houses. So after the Lord Paramounts, we have the High Lordships. Now, a High Lord is basically, I think it's a term they invented, because I don't think there are actually High Lords in the show or the books, but they have to call them something different, because otherwise everyone's a Lord, and that's extremely confusing. So a High Lord is basically a Duke, and a Duke controls several counties, or what we would probably today call provinces. So let's go to a map of Europe. So this is kind of, this is a map of the subdivisions of Europe. So these are the provinces or states contained within a nation or a country. Now, as you can see, they're much, much smaller, and there's a lot more of them than there are countries. And a duke would generally rule over. They obviously the duchies weren't the same as this, but a duke would rule over a piece of land about that size, or about that size, or about that size. There would be a couple dozen, a dozen to a couple dozen duchies in a country, and they would rule over them. And a duchy is composed of multiple counties. We still have counties. Counties are basically a settlement or a piece of land in the area around it. So, um, like, there would be a Duke of like New York State would be an example. I mean, America's never been a monarchy really, but there, for instance, there'd be like a Duke of New York. There'd be a Duke of like Nova Scotia, a Duke of some region of the country, and they would control it. And they would have a number of houses sworn to their service. So in Game of Thrones, we have a number of High Lords, and they tend to be the lords who are mentioned and who are obviously powerful. They're almost as powerful as Lord Paramonts, but not quite as much. So we have the Freys. The Freys are a High Lordship. Uh, the lands of the Crossing are all this area. So that includes the land that the Freys control personally, and the land a house controls personally is called the Demesne. The Demesne is land that is held and administered personally by the Lord and is not held in vassalage by anyone. King's Landing, for instance, is held directly by the king. The king has direct control of King's Landing. All taxes paid by King's Landing go directly to him, um, and no one administers it on his behalf. Or if he appoints someone, that person is basically a civil servant or a bureaucrat and not a lord in their own right. Like Robert appointed Renly to rule the Stormlands. Oops, sorry. So he does not rule the Stormlands anymore directly. It is not part of his demesne because Robert gave it up. So some other high lordships, we have Lord Wyman Manderley and House Manderley of White Harbor. So they control White Harbor and I believe, what's their fort called? The Wolf's Den and Newcastle are controlled directly by House Manderley. They are part of the Demesne. They are part of the unalienable lands that House Manderley holds directly and draws direct tax revenue for. And these are all counties which are sworn to the service of House Manderley. So it's a very hierarchical order. So a county is like White Harbor or Moat Cailin or Greywater Watch or something like that, and they are held, generally speaking, by a lord, but sometimes by a high lord, and they are all sworn to a high lord. All counts are sworn to a high lord or a lord paramount, and they pay taxes to the high lord. Then the high lord pays taxes to their king or to the lord paramount, and then if there's any tax money left over, they give the money to the king or the emperor. So if we look at, generally speaking, lords paramount also possess a high lordship or a duchy of their own because if they don't control a certain amount of land directly, then they're weaker than basically all of their vassals, which is one of the reasons why Westeros is so unstable, because if you look at regions, the crown lands are tiny. And they look a bit bigger here, but they're very sparsely populated. The land's not particularly good. It's a bit like the Stormlands. If Robert had been smart, he would have merged the Stormlands and the Crown Lands into the Iron Throne's demesne, and that would have given him an army as big as most of his vassals. So at least he wouldn't be weaker than any of the people who are sworn to serve him. He actually lost a lot of power by becoming king, just because of the way the world is set up. So that's basically, so let's just see here. Let's turn on, can I turn on counties? Let's look at some more high lordships. See, High Lordship of Highgarden, that's the land that Tyrells hold directly and govern from Highgarden. As you can see, some high lordships are stronger than others. Like Old Town, the High Towers are one of the strongest high lordships. They control a lot of land and they are immensely wealthy. The Westerlings control a rather weak high lordship, House Westerling. Whereas some others, like the the Good Brothers, are a lot bigger, and the Harlows are fairly large too. I believe that is, let me see here. Yeah, Roderick the Reader. Roderick the Reader is a Harlow, and they control one of the larger islands. So in a lot of cases, High Lords can be stronger than the Lord Paramount. So Lord Paramounts, generally speaking, maintain power by having their own demesne, which tends to be the richest and best land, and they often will use the tax money to improve their land and ensure that they have a strong military. But they also have to make sure that at least some of their vassals support them. Because if none of their vassals support them, their vassals can easily overthrow them. But if about half of them support them, they're generally speaking stronger than any of their vassals. So if they can maintain at least about like 40 to 50% of their vassals loyal to them, then they can theoretically fight off any revolt. Now there are noble families who are not even high lords. Like let me see, where's the Danes? Sir Arthur Dane and Darkstar. Let me just see here. I'm trying to remember what Starfall. Oh no, the Danes are high lords. My bad. Um, I thought the Danes were not high lords. Let me think here. Try to think of a house because most of the houses who are mentioned in the series are high lords. You know who aren't high lords? Let me see. Where is the? Okay, the Cleganes. The Cleganes are just lords or knights. They're landed knights actually. The difference between a landed knight and a lord is extremely narrow. I don't really think there is that much of a difference. Knights control a slightly smaller bit of land, but generally speaking, it's not that significant. Let me see here. Um, so a landed knight will basically have a castle and a bit of land around it, whereas a lord, but not a high lord, will have a bit of land, but not really like a city or a settlement and a castle maybe and a bit of land, but not much else. So like okay, the Lannisters of Lannisport would be an example of a lord. They control Lannisport, which is a very rich city, but they don't really control anything beyond that. They are a direct vassal of the Lord Paramountcy, and they are not High Lords. They control a single county, but that single county is one of the richest places in all of Westeros. I think Gulltown is also like no, it's not in this scenario. In some scenarios, Gulltown is its own lordship. Uh, Here we go. House Derry. House Derry is just a lordship. It is not a high lord. There's not a high lord of Derry. I believe Derry's mentioned a couple times. But yeah, they only control one county. So when they talk about giving like Littlefinger the lordship of Harrenhal, what they did was they gave him the high lordship of Harrenhal, which is one of the largest fiefs in Westeros, but they also made him Lord Paramount of the Riverlands. So they basically made him a king. And that's scandalous because he doesn't really come from a noble background, or he comes from the smallest of small lords. So, that's part of how it works. Then we have the small council. Now, the small council is, let's see here, is basically works in the same way as a modern cabinet. They're essentially there's not much of a difference between them. The positions are just kind of different. So these are people, nobles, who are appointed from throughout the realm, and they have cabinet level powers over different things. The Hand of the King is basically a prime minister. The Master of Laws is kind of like the Attorney General. Also, I suppose, kind of would also do diplomacy and stuff like that. The Master of Arms or the Master of Soldiers controls the King's armies. There are different titles depending on the show or books. The Master of Coin is the Minister of Finance. The Master of Whisters is like the Minister of State Security or the Minister of Internal Affairs. The Maester is just an advisor, and there's often a Septon as well. I guess in this case I can't set the High Sept. So they're appointed from all over Westeros, and they administer specific things, but generally speaking, most of their influence is confined to the Crown lands, because those are the only lands that the king controls directly. And he has to depend upon the willingness of his lords to cooperate. So the Iron Throne is largely a trap. It's a position significantly less powerful than any of the Lord Paramountcies that relies upon the cooperation and goodwill of those under your command in order to get anything done or even to survive, which is not a good position to be in. So I hope that explained how things work. If you like this format, I'll do more of them. This is Argent Templar signing out.